Harry has an MBA. He's a businessman in Virginia, but he has an MBA and he's a historian and a prolific author. He was born in Germany, born and raised in Germany, lives in Virginia now, lives close to the National Archives where he spent a lot of time gathering research for his books. So here's his latest book, and here's some of the other ones. He's a prolific and really interesting writer. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Harry and take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try not to speak with a microphone, but can everybody hear me? Is that okay?
Yes.
I used to be a drill sergeant in the German army. So I do have a loud voice. Yes, so I do have an MBA, but I also have a Master of Arts from University of Arizona. And so I am actually a real historian, although I don't have a PhD. I would like to, before we get started, I would like to really thank and give a hand of applause to John Reed, who put together this wonderful event, who is running an incredible museum. I love the Pancho Villa Museum, and so let's all give a hand. I would also like to mention a few people here in the audience that many of you might know. I'm absolutely honored and thrilled to have Louis R. Sadler and Charles Harris III sitting right here in the audience. My absolute heroes. They have published more books about the Mexican Revolution than anybody else, and they are the scholars when it comes to border history, the Mexican Revolution at the border. They have written incredible books like The Secret War in El Paso, The Plan de San Diego, and most recently The Great CallUp. So please give a hand to also in the audience is Helen Patton. There is a funny story. Our families are actually connected, even though we didn't know we would meet each other here. My wife's sister married General Patton's grandson, and so they're cousins too. There's another story about this. My grandfather lived in a castle in Germany, right at the border to East Germany, the demarcation line. And the Russians came across the border. It was a castle, nice place to make your headquarters. And they threw my grandfather out. My grandfather sent a messenger to the American lines and happened to come upon the camp of General George S. Patton. Told him that the Russians had come across the border. George S. Patton, as everybody could imagine, jumped in his Jeep with a few aides, drove to my grandfather's house, threw the Russians out. My grandfather thanked him so much for saving his house, and George Patton looked around and said, you know, this is a damn nice house. I think I'll take that. So here's the family relationship. Helen would like to announce something.
Well, actually, on the way, or around about that same time, my grandfather was also inspecting Russian prison camps, and with German prisoners. And at one of those prison camps was my husband's, not anymore my husband, but my beloved former husband's grandfather. And the Russians wanted to show off how well they do away with these unnecessary prisoners. And my grandfather was furious, stood in front of them and said, "Take me before you take a prisoner during peacetime," and let them all go. So that's a reconciliation. But this is your moment, and I just want to take the opportunity, though, for both of us, if you wouldn't mind, if we could pass this around quietly, that if you could put your name, and email is preferable, but if you don't have an email, your phone, or whatever you'd like to allow us to see, so that we can keep in touch with you about all these great reconciliation stories and all, okay? And my book is not available today because UPS failed to deliver it, so therefore I will be donating 40 copies to your museum and 40 copies to
Thank you, Helen. One last announcement. In the room is also a great-great-grandson of General Pancho Villa. Tonio. This is the mission and the work of the Pancho Villa Park and the Pancho Villa Museum. It is reconciliation. And I can tell you, coming from Germany, If we would be angry about what happened in our history, we would be doing nothing but be angry about it. So let's try to take down walls and take down borders and be friends. After 100 years, I think we can all agree. Let's study objective history. Let's look at facts and discuss facts and have discourse on that. But let the emotions be the emotions of the past. Okay, so I would like to start. My presentation is has the purpose to look at the Pancho Villa raid of 1916 in a different perspective, the perspective of what was going on in the world. It's very easy to really study the very small town of Columbus and possible reasons, bank robbery, anger against a local merchant, what other theories are out there. But let's not forget, at the time that this happened, we had the Mexican Revolution going on, we had World War I going on, and of course these momentous events had a large role to play in what happened here. And I said earlier today to a journalist, you know, in reality, if I as a German look at the Columbus raid, it is here in Columbus where the defeat of Germany in World War I happened. Think about this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
World War I is going on. American troops are now going into Mexico, training, arming, learning about logistics and airplanes, and then they go to Germany or Europe in 1918, and Germany was defeated. So it has a large part to play. So we cannot think about just Columbus as a little thing. This is a global event that happened here, and we should treat it as such. I have spent many years researching primary documents. So I'm an independent scholar. Like John mentioned, I live close to the National Archives, so it's my second home. I look at documents in the National Archives. I've also traveled to Mexico, I've traveled to Germany, and I have tried to triangulate documents that are now available. History is constantly moving, right? We constantly have new documents, new ways to look at things. So the books, when you read them, these are probably in some respects some of the most recent original documents used. Some of them never been used by historians before, and what you see here is the result of this research. So let's look real quick at the history of the Mexican Revolution. I call it Opposing the Usurper. Okay. Opposing the Usurper. So in the Mexican Revolution, of course, started out in 1910. Cut the light back on. The Mexican Revolution started out in 1910. President, who later became President Madero, Francisco Madero, started the opposition against Porfirio Diaz. Madero did defeat him quite quickly. In May 1911, Diaz went into exile on the German ship Ipiranga, a Hapak ship Ipiranga. President Madero first let somebody else run the presidency, then later became the first democratically elected president of Mexico in the fall of 1911. 1912, there were quite a few upheavals. The Orozco rebellion happened, the Reyes rebellion happened, so the revolutionary alliance was kind of falling apart. And in February 1913, in the Decena Tragica, President Madero was deposed and murdered. And so this started what I will talk about today. This started a counter-revolution. So the usurper president was Victoriano Huerta, who took power in Mexico, and immediately forces that were formerly aligned with Madero joined, and Venustiano Carranza, the governor of Coahuila, was one of the first one who declared himself in opposition, and he started a constitutionalist fight against the usurper president. And he assembled a quite large group of forces. Some of his generals included Pancho Villa, who played a role in the Madero Revolution as well. Pancho Villa entered Mexico on the 6th of March 1913, so shortly after President Madero was murdered, with 8 men and a few munitions and not much money. He entered near El Paso to fight the usurper, and within a year he returned to Ciudad Juarez at the head of 40,000 troops. So if you think about the success of Pancho Villa in recruiting people It was unbelievable, but of course it had to do with him being very charismatic, being an incredible military leader. He won many battles in the period of 1913 and 1914. Here you see him, one of the more famous pictures at the head of his troops. He was a little bit of a daredevil. He actually rode in front of his troops in many attacks, and luckily never got shot or killed. At the height of success, there is a German naval intelligence agent that is very close to Pancho Villa. His name is Felix A. Sommerfeld. This is a picture of him right there. Felix Sommerfeld had a history in Mexico. He came to first to the United States and then to Mexico as a mining engineer in the early 1900s. He then joins the Madero Revolution, and my contention in my first book is that he was actually put there by the German government. Why would they do that? Of course, Germany was one of the main trading partners of Mexico, and it was very important for them to know who would be the next leader after Diaz, who was already 80 years old. So Felix Sommerfeld ended up being one of the close advisors of President Madero. He became the head of the Mexican Secret Service, and in the Orozco uprising, he actually commanded over 200 secret agents on this side of the border in the United States to prevent smuggling of arms to the Orozquista forces. And it's an incredible story. Professors Harris and Sadler have talked about this. He basically ran the largest operation of a foreign intelligence service on US soil in the history of the United States. And you're the only ones that ever mentioned that. That is something that was not really remembered very much. Sommerfeld then joined the Carranza forces after President Madero's downfall, and did not like President Carranza very much. He thought he was stubborn and pig-headed and unreasonable. And about 9 months later, he joins the Villa forces. Some split was developing between Villa and Carranza since Villa got more and more powerful. And his role in the Villistas was to procure arms and munitions. So Sommerfeld had very close relations with trading houses in New York and also along the border with the Western Cartridge Company, one of the big cartridge manufacturers in Alton, Illinois. And he was the one that really supplied the División del Norte with munitions, while, of course, he's giving information to the German government. Some of the interesting things we know about General Villa is he was very much into propaganda. He wanted the United States to like him, and as we heard earlier speakers say, this was actually the case, that the United States was quite friendly with Pancho Villa. One of the people in charge of his propaganda and him looking good to the United States was Felix A. Sommerfeld. Here you see a picture during the Battle of Ojinaga in the winter of 1913-1914. Pancho Villa is stopping the battle at one point to restage troops so the filmmakers could actually have a better view of the troops. And some of these things were also just restaged, so they were not actually part of the battle. But out came several movies that were huge successes in the United States. Pancho Villa is played by himself. We know the movie with Banderas that was remaking it. The original movies have been lost, sadly. So anyway, so he was a hero also here in the United States. Yeah. Cracks in the alliance. So if you think about the alliance of the constitutionalist forces, so in the beginning you have Emiliano Zapata joining, you have Pancho Villa joining, you have of course Carranza, Obregón, the Calais people from Sonora, so a large coalition of people joined in the constitutionalist army. And of course, since the rise of Pancho Villa was so significant, it became an issue of jealousy. So Carranza was worried about Pancho Villa having gained so much power, and so some rifts developed. The Carrancistas tried to slow down Villa's advance towards Mexico City. They withheld coal from him, which angered him a lot. And in April 1914, the German ship Ipiranga, the same ship that took President Diaz into exile, approached the harbor of Veracruz with, and I will dispute this in a second, German weapons. And President Wilson was woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the decision was made to occupy the harbor of Veracruz to prevent General Huerta to get these weapons. And so in the morning of that day, the American Marines landed in Veracruz, secured the harbor and the customs house. Here is a picture of troops marching through the streets of Veracruz to prevent these weapons from reaching Huerta. Slight problem, they came too early. The ship had not even been docked in the harbor yet. The ship was outside of the harbor, and when the troops came into harbor, they had not communicated with Germany. Germany had no idea what this was all about. They of course complained at the Americans making demands on the Germans, and the Americans decided to let the ship go, and the ship went down the coast to Puerto Mexico, unloaded, and Huerta did get his weapons. Not very well organized. Interesting is, though, the weapons were not German weapons. The weapons were owned by an American who actually did loan money to Huerta, but they were American arms. And to get around the embargo that existed at the time, they were sent to Europe, and then from Europe back to the United States, and to Mexico, and they just happened to be on a German ship, the Ipiranga. The German government had no idea what this was all about, and the American government did not tell the Germans anything. When you read today Barbara Tuchman's book and so forth, it's always about the Germans supporting General Huerta. Not true. Not true. They had no idea. The German government had absolutely nothing to do with it. It was a commercial ship carrying American arms that was trying to get around the embargo. What was the reaction of the Mexican factions, revolutionary factions, to this occupation? Carranza, of course, a big nationalist, minded, and voiced a great opposition to the American invasion of Mexico, and asked them to immediately withdraw and get the hell out of there. And Felix Sommerfeld, who was advising Pancho Villa, and whose task was to make Pancho Villa look very good in front of the American government, so eventually maybe he would be, or his faction would be, recognized diplomatically as the ruling faction of Mexico. And so Felix Sommerfeld advised Pancho Villa not to oppose the Americans in this occupation. And this is a very obvious, very first rift, open rift between Carranza and Villa. Villa declared publicly that he had no problems with the Americans occupying Veracruz. For him, it was Huerta's downfall, and he was happy that they did that, and Carranza really disputed that, so that was a big rift. Okay. Another issue about the Mexican Revolution that is not much talked about, and that is very important when you think about the attack of Columbus. I call it the forgotten battle. The longest battle of the revolution was the siege of Naco, Sonora. And this siege lasted for 119 days. It's the longest battle of the Mexican Revolution. There's only one scientific article published about the Battle of Naco, which is very strange to me. And very important about the Battle of Naco is that basically the Federales are pushed, not the Federales, the Calais and the Sonoran revolutionaries are pushed against the American border, and by General Maitolena, the governor of Sonora. And bullets were flying across the border. There's a Naco, Arizona, and the U.S. Army, to protect the citizens of Naco, Arizona, immediately started bringing troops there, and the situation got pretty hot. So there were lots of, at one point Mexican forces came actually across the border, and several people were killed. People at that time had the unhealthy habit to watch battles in Mexico on top of rail cars, so the U.S. Army would usually put rail cars along the border to prevent bullets from hitting the American towns like El Paso or Naco, but American citizens from the American towns would sit on top of the rail cars and watch the battle. So that didn't help very much. In any case, the siege of Naco was resolved diplomatically. So General Hugh Lennox Scott, the chief of staff of the army under President Wilson came down to the border, and negotiations were led between General Maitorena and Scott and Calais. And the solution basically was, after a while, we need Pancho Villa, who was aligned with Maitorena, to sign off on this deal to just withdraw the troops. And representative of Pancho Villa in these negotiations was Felix A. Sommerfeld, the German naval intelligence agent. He became very close to Hugh Lennox Scott. The negotiations went well. The Maitorena's forces actually withdrew in the end. And what did Sommerfeld learn from this? He learned how close Mexico and the United States could be brought to military intervention. It was this close in the siege of Naco that the Americans would come across the border and make peace in a forceful way. And so later on he wrote to his superiors in the German government in May 1915. He said, "I know how to get the Americans to create a military intervention. I can do this for you." He learned this in the Battle of Naco. So we go through 1914, the highest time for Pancho Villa, but in 1915 his fortunes start to decline. Very famous, the battles of Celaya and later the Battle of Leon. These battles were devastating for the Villista armies. They got pounded by superior military strategy of Álvaro Obregón, pushed north. They also ran out of money. So while Sommerfeld supplied weapons and munitions to Villa, until that time he was paid to do that. So Villa had quite a lot of money. He had plundered haciendas of the Terrazas family in Chihuahua. He paid for his munitions. But in the summer of 1915, this changes. And in fact, he ran out of money, and Sommerfeld and the German government jumped in and actually supplied him free of charge with munitions. Here's a picture of General Álvaro Obregón after the Battle of Leon. Very famous, the right arm is severed. Interesting also for me as a German historian, while Obregón lay in his tent with the arm shot off by shrapnel, and in fact suicidal, so his aides were trying to prevent him from just shooting himself. A German member of his staff took over. His name was Arnoldo Krumheller, and the Battle of Leon was then finished, and Villa lost with German commanders at the head of Álvaro Obregón's army. So let's talk about one other aspect, the Plan de San Diego. So what is the friction between the United States and Mexico? And please, Dr. Sadler, scream loudly if I say something wrong. They published a book called The Plan de San Diego. And I hope I will say this correctly the way you researched it. So the Plan de San Diego was an uprising along the border. It started at the lower Rio Grande Valley, and the plan was conceived in the spring of 1915. And let me read real quick why this would upset Americans. Oh, here it is. Here are just some parts of this plan. The manifesto included passages that alarmed American officials who first saw a copy of the plan at the end of January 1915. Objective number 5 read, "It is strictly forbidden to hold prisoners. They shall be shot immediately without any pretext." Number 6, every foreigner, i.e. any non-Chicano, who shall be found armed and cannot prove his right to carry arms shall be summarily executed. Number 7, every North American over 16 years of age shall be put to death. So this is quite violent. The plan fell into the hands of local law enforcement, but not much happened. There's really no real activity until the summer of about June of 1915. And in June 1915, suddenly several raids on haciendas, on hardware stores, robberies of mines and shops suddenly happened. Several people were killed, and as Dr. Sadler and Dr. Harris uncovered, from the actual originator of the Plan de San Diego. President Carranza was the one behind this violence. He was trying to put the American government under pressure to recognize him as the superior faction in Mexico. And of course that makes sense, since Pancho Villa was losing battle after battle. Now Carranza is the dominant force in Mexico. The violence that resulted from the Plan de San Diego was quite significant, because it was not only the raiders that were pursued, but there were also hostilities between the Mexican-American population, the Anglo population, and some scores were settled, and Texas Rangers were involved, and so there's a bunch of evidence that the violence, exceeded actually the actual raiders, and people were killed. And so here's one of the pictures where Texas Rangers are showing off proudly some raiders that they killed. So this is the pretext now. We talked a little bit about the Mexican Revolution. We're now in 1915, and in the summer of 1915 we have violence at the border. We have Pancho Villa losing battles. We have the military being involved, so there's also lots of military along the border. Now let's look at US foreign policy. And one of the important things is the Pan American Conference. So on June 2nd, 1915, President Wilson made a proclamation and basically told all Mexican factions, if you cannot decide on a president that you can all agree on, we will do it for you. And you have a few months' time to figure this out, and the agency that would decide on who would be the next president, who would be approved, was the Pan American Conference. A flurry of activity started after this June 2 speech, and basically lobbyists from all factions were in Washington and were trying to negotiate. At the same time, as I said, the Plan de San Diego violence is increasing rapidly, and it was Carranza's way of pushing the United States to basically think that Carranza will be the only one that can pacify Mexico. There's another aspect to US foreign policy that is very interesting. This is called the Canova Conspiracy. It was first written about by Friedrich Katz, a historian. Here's Leon Canova. Leon Canova is a very interesting guy. He was a diplomat, low-level diplomat in Mexico, and he smuggled Eduardo Iturbide, the former police chief of Mexico City. He smuggled him to the United States about a year before the time we're talking about, Christmas 1914, smuggled him to the United States to save him from the wrath of the Zapatistas who wanted to execute him. Pancho Villa, who was in Mexico City at the time, realized what was happening, and the Villistas pursued this train that carried Iturbide and Canova north and tried to get Iturbide extracted from the railroad car. But Canova, being a diplomat, did not allow his compartment to be searched. When they finally searched it in Ciudad Juarez, Iturbide was long gone. He had exited the train way before, and he was making his way to the United States on foot and on horseback, and he made it safely. As a result of this incident, Pancho Villa proclaimed that if Canova ever set foot into Mexico again, he would be executed. So, here is Canova in Washington, D.C. He's a diplomat. He is very well respected in the Wilson administration. What do? They make him the head of the Mexican desk in the State Department. So Pancho Villa now has a formidable enemy at the Mexican desk of the State Department. And so Canova was an interesting manipulator. He did not like Pancho Villa for obvious reasons. So in the summer of 1915, when all this diplomatic flurry was going on, trying to get the United States to figure out, who they would recognize as president, Canova, on the one hand, is working with Secretary Lansing. Let's see where he is. Not here yet. He's working with Secretary Lansing to influence President Wilson to recognize the Carranza faction. And Lansing is a very interesting entry in his diary, because since I'm German, I always have to find the German connection here. Lansing supporting the recognition of Carranza had something to do with Germany. Let me read you from his diary. Germany does not want one faction dominant in Mexico. Therefore, we must recognize one faction dominant in Mexico. It comes down to this. Our possible relations with Germany must be our first consideration, and all our intercourse with Mexico must be regulated accordingly. So Lansing was convinced that Germany was trying to create trouble for the United States along the border, and he was right. And that was his idea to settle this problem, is just recognize the strongest faction, which was Carranza. So while Canova and Lansing work on Wilson to recognize Carranza, Canova at the same time dispatches Hugh Lennox Scott, the general that we talked earlier about, Hugh Lennox Scott to the border with Felix A. Sommerfeld to negotiate with Pancho Villa to give back a lot of properties that he had expropriated from American investors, mines, railroads, etc. And Pancho Villa actually, even though he's bankrupt at that point, releases $6 million, so in today's money times 21, that's a lot of money, releases $6 million in properties and assets in Mexico, and as Villa himself said, they dangled recognition, diplomatic recognition in front of me, which of course never happened. Canova had a totally different plan. Very interesting though when we talk about the reasons for the raid on Columbus, because Pancho Villa felt betrayed. And Hugh Lennox Scott, a member of the Wilson administration, the chief of the army, and in fact briefly also the Secretary of War, Scott himself thought that he was betrayed. And he wrote so in his memoirs. So this is not something the Germans just made up or Pancho Villa made up. There were people that were seriously questioning what the Wilson administration later did. So in September 1915, the Wilson administration basically announces that they will probably recognize Carranza as the legal president of Mexico. And this was rubber-stamped by the Pan-American Conference, even though many of the members of the conference were completely dumbfounded because they were supposed to negotiate for a unity government. And suddenly Wilson decided not to do that. Within days of the declaration that the Wilson administration will recognize President Carranza as the de facto president of Mexico, they shut down all supplies for Pancho Villa. Many of you know probably the Battle of Agua Prieta in Sonora, where American troops, American trains shepherded 4,500 troops, Mexican troops, through U.S. property, through U.S. land, to Agua Prieta. It was a horrible defeat for the Villistas. Pancho Villa was very angry about that. There were also rumors that floodlights were shining on the battlefield at night. One of the prowesses of the Villistas was to attack at night, illuminated the battlefield, and these lights were actually supplied by the U.S. Army. I could not find proof of that, but I don't know where those lights came from. But certainly helped destroying Villa's attacks. I'm looking specifically here, Sac-Lamar Cobb, the customs collector of El Paso, and because here are other things that have not been really written about. How was Villa cut off? Coal was made a contraband. So Sac-Lamar Cobb made sure that the Villistas could not get any coal, which means they couldn't run their trains. He also refused to allow cattle from the Villistas to come over to the United States. And the way he did that is he said he had to check on the marks on the cattle to make sure they're not stolen. It's really funny. Of course, they were probably all stolen, right? And they have been for years, right? So they're cutting off the Villistas for making any kind of income. And the campaign in Sonora turns into a rout. There are several more battles. Villa, in the end, comes across the Sierra Madres, and he's finished. Okay, so let's look at the third aspect of this whole puzzle. We looked at the Mexican Revolution, we looked at US foreign policy, now let's look at Germany. As we said, World War I is going on. What is Germany doing? The first thing is that in 1914, the Entente powers, as well as Germany, tried to buy as many arms and munitions on the US market to send to Europe to the battlefields. Especially England, which did not have any lasting supplies, was very interested in buying munitions from the United States. The English instituted a sea blockade, so German ships could not transport anything, so they were cut off. So the United States basically became a big supplier for the enemies of Germany. So one of the first things that the German government tried to institute in the United States is to send out agents under the command of Franz von Papen. Anybody knows what happened to him later on? Yes, he became German Chancellor, and he's the one that actually convinced Hindenburg to let Hitler come to power because I can control him. So Franz von Papen is basically getting money from the German War Department to buy up as many munitions as they can. In fact, they had a plan to corner the whole munitions market of the United States. It would have cost $2 million. $2 million. They could have cornered they could have, every factory that was making munitions could have been filled up with orders, and they would not be able to sell anything to Entente. The German government thought that was too expensive. I'm not kidding you. So what they did is they dispatched agents such as Felix A. Sommerfeld to buy up munitions, and Sommerfeld is the first one. He said, hey, I know what to do. We send them to Mexico. And so he was supplying Pancho Villa anyway, right? Another German agent was also sending munitions to Carranza. Papen himself, with Hans Tauscher, the representative of the Krupp factories, also a German agent, they were outfitting ships with munitions to go to India to fight against the British in the independence war of India. And so Mexico was really a great outlet for these munitions. And so the German agents swarmed out all over the United States trying to find munitions and send them to Mexican revolutionaries. I'm pointing out this man here, Heine. He was the head of Hapag Mexico, and he was in charge of the landing of the Ipiranga. And he wrote later, and an American actually seconded that. He said the Americans were so stupid, all they had to do is ask me, and I would have given them the weapons. But they refused, and so the Ipiranga went on south, as we know. Heine transfers to New York after the outbreak of World War I and the sea blockade, because Hapag business was finished, obviously, and became one of the central agents in the United States. And he was in charge later on. Somebody said he was coming from Bridgeport, Connecticut earlier. The Bridgeport Projectile Company was a factory that the Germans bought, and Heine actually ran. Another thing that's very important to know about German policy is the whole question of unrestricted submarine warfare, the issue that finally brought the United States and Germany into the war. There was a big division within the German government. Should we do submarine warfare or not against commerce ships? The big issue was, of course, the United States was sending all these munitions to Europe, many of them on leased ships, not English ships, not French ships, but ships registered who knows where, also including the United States. And the Germans, in order to stop these munition shipments, would have to sink these ships. And the Wilson administration was very strongly, was adamant that, these are neutral ships that can't be sunk. Another problem with the submarine warfare was in the Declaration of London that Germany was a signatory to. A ship that was stopping a neutral ship had to shoot across its bow, make the ship stop, then check the papers and have the right to search the ship. If they find contraband, they have to make sure that the people on the ship are safe. So they had to put them in boats or on their own ship and take them to the coast. And then they were allowed to sink the ship or take it as a prize. Well, with a submarine, that is pretty impossible. The moment a submarine surfaced, English captains had orders to ram it immediately. Submarines were very vulnerable, very slow, 9 knots traveling speed, and so most commerce ships were much faster than that. If they got away from the torpedoes, they could ram one of these submarines. Many submarines sank that way. So there was a big division within the German government. Should we do unrestricted submarine warfare and risk an American entry into the war or not? In May 1915, so a week after the sinking of the Lusitania, I don't know if many people people remember, 1915, a huge passenger liner was sunk by a German submarine. 128 Americans were killed. And 1 week later, Sommerfeld proposes, together with Bernhard Dernburg, also an agent in New York, who is in charge of propaganda. He proposes to the German government, based on his experiences at NACO just a few months earlier, do you want me to create a war between Mexico and the United States? And this was sent to the German government. It went all the way to Chancellor von Bethmann-Hollweg, so the head of the German government other than the Kaiser. And the answer came back quickly, do it. Okay, so there was a standing order to create a war between Mexico and the United States. Why would the German government want to do that? They very clearly, the military wanted unrestricted submarine warfare. The State Department or Foreign Office didn't want it. So the compromise was, hey, if you guys can get the Americans occupied at the border so that they cannot participate in the European war, then we'll agree to submarine warfare. So this is why Sommerfeld's proposal was so important. It was perfectly on time. We also look at remember the Plan de San Diego, right? These uprisings along the border and so forth. Was there German involvement? Because they happened after this Sommerfeld proposal, after the idea, can we create trouble at the border? Professor Harrison Sadler definitively could not find any evidence that on a tactical level there was any German involvement. It was really Carranza. On a strategic level, I have not found evidence, but I think if a researcher ever digs all the way through the Mexican archives, might find something that the German government actually supported Carranza, either financially or with advice, whatever it may be, to start this. So there could be on another level, could be German support. I did find this guy Krumheller. Remember the guy that led the Battle of Leon after Obregón was injured? This guy, he looks Mexican, doesn't he? Kaiser Wilhelm here. This is out of his own book. He actually traveled the Southwest. He traveled through El Paso, San Antonio, and so forth in the summer of 1915 and talked to American and Mexican communities and made propaganda for the Carrancista ideology. And so, in my personal opinion, he participated in rowing up the local populations as part of the Plan de San Diego. Free munitions. Again, we remember Pancho Villa is on decline, he runs out of money. The German government says we must help this man. Sommerfeld was the guy that could do it. And so here are here you can see some of his checks and so forth. This is from his bank account. In the summer of 1915, he actually supplies Villa with arms and munitions, and they were paid by the German government. Historian Friedrich Katz is the first one to uncover that. In his research, it's $380,000 times 21, so that's a lot of money. I found evidence that it was far over $600,000 that Sommerfeld got from the German government to do that. So definitely support. As a result of Villa's downfall and the recognition of Carranza, Villa declares in December 1915, he declares war on the United States. And strangely, this has really never been published much. Not published in newspapers and so forth. Pancho Villa declared war on the United States. The raid on Columbus happened after Pancho Villa declared war. You have to understand that. It did not come out of nowhere. By the way, the same thing happened with the terrorists that attacked New York, right? There was a declaration of war of Al-Qaeda before they attacked New York. So here's Pancho Villa. So there's a declaration of war, and of course, the German agents looking to somehow create trouble at the border. Now it's December, so this is already months and months after they had orders to create trouble. They did not really know what to do, and suddenly now they have a boon of opportunity because Pancho Villa said, I'm going to make sure the Americans will get it. So what do? Here's again our friends Franz von Patton, and here's another one. He's the naval attaché in New York. His name is Carl Boyette. He's actually Sommerfeld's boss. He runs this naval intelligence service for the Germans in New York. In December 1915, Sommerfeld, von Papen, Boyet, and Sommerfeld as a representative of Pancho Villa get together with representatives of Felix Diaz. Felix Diaz is one of the factions that really never got hold in Mexico. He was supported by the Catholic Church. And so in the end of 1915, in January 1916, Pascual Orozco is dead. Huerta is about to be dead. He dies in January. So the Científico faction, the conservative faction, is basically without leadership. Felix Diaz is trying to rally this leadership, this following behind him, and he has the support of the Catholic Church that was opposed to Carranza. Papen puts together the Villa faction with Felix Diaz. There's an agreement that they would now start a new faction that would go to Mexico and challenge the presidency of Carranza. And in order to consummate this new relationship, this new Mexican faction sends a representative. His name is Gonzalo Enrile. Gonzalo Enrile used to be the connection between Terrazas, the Terrazas family, and Orozco. So he was the finance man for Orozco in the Great Uprising. Enrile travels to Germany with a plan. And the plan was supposed to be presented to the German government. They wanted to have money to start this new war. And at the same time, Villa and other forces along the border should put together a new faction and start this war. And let me read you some of the proposals that Enrile made. First, installation of Mexican policies completely supportive of German policy, which is aimed against the interests of the United States. Second, granting concessions to Germany of railroads, petroleum, mines, and commerce. Third, expulsion of American capital from the country through expropriation. Fourth, creation of an army strong enough to attack the United States in a, for Germany and Mexico, favorable moment. Fifth, support of a separatist movement that already exists in several southern states of the United States, namely Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and the south of Upper California. They're talking about the uprising under the Plan de San Diego. And seven, financial guarantees to Germany for weapons and munition in a for Germany agreeable form. The total sum, partly in cash, partly in weapons, munitions, and other war materials, needed for an invasion of the United States amounts to 300 million marks. Any questions to be directed at Captain von Patton? This is the original document, I'm not kidding you. Patton drafted this proposal. Enrile went to Germany, and the German Foreign Office, who did not want to have a war and drag the United States into the war, they stopped Enrile in Spain, made it very hard for him to move on. Enrile never made it to Germany before the raid on Columbus. And this is the reason why Enrile's proposals have been ignored by most historians. But they were critical, because if you look at history, you have to make sure that you look at it from the perspectives of the actors at the time. Remember, there's not much communication going on. Nobody knows where Enrile right now is in Europe. His task was to travel to Germany and get this money. And in order to show that this new faction was serious, they were to show that they are ready to combat the United States. First thing happens January 9. Attack of American miners in Santa Isabel. 19 miners killed, executed. Pablo Lopez, one of the Dorados, one of Villa's captains, in charge of that. And then, of course, the raid happens. So here are the strange bedfellows, right? Villa and Diaz. Here is the head of the Catholic Church in Chicago, who funneled money from Papen to this new faction. And I have proof of that. I found it in the archives. So this is actually the Catholic Church, probably unknowingly, financed the raid on Columbus. It's all in this book. So now the raid happened. So my theory of the raid that happened on the 9th, 100 years ago, at 4:11 in the morning, my theory is that this was the first attack, the first show of a new war between Mexico and the United States. All the while, Felix Sommerfeld had told Pancho Villa how Carranza had given away the country, how Carranza might have given the rights to the Magdalena Bay to the Americans, rights to custom houses, the secret pact between Carranza and the American government. That was the rumor. Even General Scott thought something unduly must have happened. And I researched this extensively. Friedrich Katz wrote in his book he couldn't find any evidence that such an agreement agreed. I disagree with that. I found quite a bit of evidence. The first thing is, the National Railroads of Mexico, the director of the railroads, was for America, favorable candidate. Carranza did not bring this guy into the realm. It was the American investors that brought this guy as head of the railroads. Carranza immediately released expropriated properties to the Americans after his recognition. He also eliminated fiat currency, one of the biggest problems the Americans had, a lot of falsified money and different currencies. Villa issued his own currency, etc. Carrancista currency was falsified. He immediately eliminated. That was one of the demands the Americans had. So there was an agreement. It might not be in writing, but there were concessions made to gain recognition. And so all the more evidence to Pancho Villa that something unduly must have happened and that maybe the sovereignty of Mexico was at stake. And people like Sommerfeld that talked to him quite frequently would make this argument even further important, right? And they try to further this argument. So we have seen many pictures throughout the day what Columbus looked like after the raid. The same man that was guilty of executing these 19 miners in Santa Isabel was also one of the commanders that came to Columbus that night. And very interestingly, he was caught later on and executed by the Carrancistas. Before he was executed, he gave a statement, and one of the few statements. Villa never said himself why he attacked Columbus. But Lopez said what was said among the Villistas. Here's a quote from his statement. Don Pancho was convinced that the gringos were too cowardly to fight us, or to try and win our country by force of arms. He said they would keep pitting one faction against another until we were all killed off. And our exhausted country would fall like a ripe pear into their eager hands. Don Pancho also told us that Carranza was selling our northern states to the gringos to get money to keep himself in power. He said he wanted to make some attempt to get intervention from the gringos before they were ready, and while we still had time to become a united nation. The Santa Isabel affair party partly satisfied my master's desire for revenge, but it did not succeed in satisfying his other wishes. So we marched on Columbus. We invaded American soil. This is one of the commanders of the raid. Very powerful. He was executed later in 1916. Pancho Villa himself, of course, was looked for, the Punitive Expedition. We've heard a lot about it. There was a reward on his head, and as his great-great-grandson told me a few days ago, a member of the people that tell me again, they discovered that was Pancho Villa's death, right? They were trying to get this reward.
What was the descendants of the people that murdered him in Parral?
Okay, so the assassin
later.
That's right. So in 1923, Pancho Villa is assassinated, and the assassins, one of the descendants of the assassins, tried to claim which is, you think, with interest and so forth, they were unsuccessful. So here are theories. What were the theories? Why did Pancho Villa attack? Well, on a very local level, people suspected maybe he wanted to rob the bank. As we know, Villa was completely cut off. He was bankrupt. He might have had deposits in the local bank that he couldn't access. That's one theory. Punish the merchant house of Sam Ravel. Also, the Ravel family is right here in Columbus this week. maybe even in this room, I don't know, but they basically released information that Ravel actually dealt mostly with the Carrancistas, so I don't think that is a good theory. Try to get loot, try to get horses, embarrass the US Army. Also a week before Columbus, Mexican prisoners were doused with kerosene in El Paso and set on fire. It might have been an accident, but it really upset the Mexican population. Vengeance for that. All these things were mentioned as theories. But if you look at the larger picture, remember Germany wanted to occupy the United States along the Mexican border, create disturbances. By the summer of 1916, the entire US Army Reserve and the entire army, save for one division that was defending Washington, D.C., were at the border or in Mexico. It walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. You know, even if the Germans definitely were clapping their hands and so forth, but they might have had more to do with it than we think. The most recent book by Dr. Harrison Sadler is called The Great CallUp, and it's about this time. It is very much underestimated how much of the US Army was really right here and in Mexico. It was tremendous. Of course, then what Villa had planned is friction with the Carrancistas in Mexico came up. There was the Battle of Carrizal. Americans were taken prisoner. In the end, the Punitive Expedition was not able to uncover Pancho Villa. Villa was injured and basically laid in a cave for most of the time that the soldiers were roaming Mexico near death. But he made it. The Punitive Expedition basically was committed to garrisons in Casas Grande and so forth, and north of there, Colonia Dublan, and were not allowed to go out anymore after these skirmishes. So what happened with the German strategy, right? And this is interesting because you would think that if my theory is correct, that in the summer of 1916 the Germans would have instituted unrestricted submarine warfare. Right? Their plan was keep the Americans busy. Now here they are, busy, but they're not declaring unrestricted submarine warfare. The German government remained deeply divided. The discussions went on through the fall of 1916, and only in February 1917 the Germans finally decided to institute unrestricted submarine warfare. By then, the US Army is well equipped, well trained. We have all these technical things that we talked about today, truck trains, airplanes, you know, everything is ready to go. And General Pershing comes out of Mexico and America declares war a few months later, and American troops go to Germany, and in the end Germany loses the war as a result of these American troops. What also happens in 1916, by the way, the same summer that Sommerfeld and the other Germans thought that they had gotten the United States to the point where they could not participate in the war, they blew up the New York harbor. The explosion at the Black Tom in July 1916, one of the largest terrorist attacks before 9/11 ever on US soil. The Black Tom Island is blown up, creating an earthquake that could be felt as far as Baltimore. Yeah. So they blew up the Black Tom, but again, divisions within the German government made it such that the submarine warfare only happened way too late, and as a result, Germany loses the war. So I thank you very much. I hope I didn't take too much of your time.